So let's start broad. How did we get here? What is the background and the context we all need to know to understand this case?
Well, over the last almost 2 decades, Sean Combs appears to have been involved in a criminal enterprise, bringing women to parties and using force and violence and guns to not only benefit himself, but as part of his business model. We saw in the last couple years that lawsuits have been filed, and I think it's that window that New York opened for civil lawsuits in 2023 that really brought in the floodgates of allegations against him. We started hearing rumors about his proclivities and sort of his behavior over the years, but it was only until these lawsuits were filed that multiple alleged victims came forward. Many of those cases were settled, but I think those facts are underlying what's being criminally prosecuted here.
Interesting. So it took those victims coming forward basically for the law to build a case against him and then arrest him yesterday and unseal the charges today. Is that correct?
It is. And what's interesting is New York opened a period of time for people to file old claims that might have otherwise been excluded under the statute of limitations. And when they opened that window, these lawsuits came in alleging conduct from over a decade ago, though it appears that Combs was involved from 2008 until even last year, some of the conduct that's been alleged. But yeah, I think it was that window and those civil suits that brought the U.S. attorney the evidence that they needed.
So let's break down the charges. The U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York unsealed 3 big charges today. What are they? What do we need to know about them?
So the first allegation is that there's a criminal enterprise. And what that means is that Combs used his business to conduct illegal activities. And when we hear that with a conspiracy, that means that there were other people involved. Though he's the only person that's been charged at this time, I know the Department of Justice is saying that perhaps there will be others. They can't commit at this point. The investigation is ongoing. But there's also allegations that involve sex trafficking and using violence in order to compel people to commit acts of sex at his force and coercion, using violence and threats and even arson. And that obviously is something that is precluded by law. Then they also allege racketeering, and that also relates to, under the RICO statute, to the conspiracy. They're allowed to bring these charges under that statute as well. So all of this appears to have been a criminal enterprise using force and violence, drugging, arson, and other criminal acts to get people to be trafficked.
I was going to say, you mentioned RICO, which I feel like we normally hear about in a business context and not in a sexual violence context. But what we have here, just to zoom out a little bit, is not just sexual violence, but allegations of a business around sexual violence.
That's what it sounds like. Sometimes when we think of RICO, we think of mobsters or other, in a financial setting, but it looks like here they're using the statute as a way to look at this enterprise being one of trafficking, human trafficking.
And I know it's still early in the legal proceedings here, but what is the punishment that Sean Diddy Combs faces for these charges if he were to be convicted?
Sure. The most serious punishment that exposes him to life is using sexual assault or violence or force on someone who's being trafficked. And so ultimately, these charges could result in him facing a life sentence.
A life sentence in prison. Wow.
Well, that's correct. Yeah. I mean, the course of conduct over a decade with multiple victims and the level and scale of violence used to commit these crimes is under the code allows that.